Thanks for being here today. The purpose of today's discussion is to have you come away with an exercise that you can implement in your agency or organization. So we're going to go through the design process. We're going to work on your own gaps, and then at the end result, as I mentioned, you'll have your own exercise. Okay, people respond the way they are trained, right? The more we can train, the more we can practice, the easier and quicker it comes to us, so we don't have to have additional time to think. And so we want to make sure that those plans, policies, and procedures are valid and that they can be implemented. It reveals these EOP or emergency response plan gaps or weaknesses. The more you prepare and test, the more that you can say, hey, we feel like we're more confident in our ability to be able to respond effectively, the more that your coordination and communication will improve, both internal to your organization as well as with your external partners. Training new and existing personnel, clarifying roles and responsibility, that's really important. Do you have part of your orientation within your facility or organization? Do you have the fact that, hey, you're going to be a part of a test or an exercise? And okay, so some of you do, some of you don't. So it's important to have that clarification of roles and responsibilities. Establishing relationship with all of the community partners, including the local, state, feds, all of those. But more importantly, it's establishing the relationship that you have here within your communities, right? Because all incidents are local, and we respond local, and that's who we need to be able to make sure that we have the ability to enhance those relationships prior to an incident. Updating your emergency operations plan, but also we know that we need to have those regulatory requirements. We're going to have the auditors come in and check things out. We want to make sure that we're crossing our T's and dotting our I's, and exercising is a part of that. So an exercise, you all know, it's a simulation designed to improve preparedness and emergency operations. It's a response based on mock events to motivate those realistic actions. We want to be able to try to mirror those actions based on what we would do in real event with a scenario. And then players react as they would in real life. So let's talk for a minute about research. So why we exercise. Research shows, there's a lot of research out there that talks about how people respond to disasters, both positively and negatively, and it's really quite interesting. Whether they're in shipwrecks, hurricanes, plane crashes, or burning buildings, people in peril experience remarkably similar stages. And the first one, even in the face of clear and urgent danger, is almost always a period of intense disbelief. People who made it out of the World Trade Center waited an average of 6 minutes before heading downstairs. Some folks waited as long as 30. Most turned off their computers, straightened their desk, went to the restroom before leaving. That's that period of disbelief. Like, what just happened? I can't believe this is happening. So what happened is, this is where it ran aground. And it started to sink, and people were, wondering what the heck's going on. Are we going to be saved? How's this all going to work? We're out in the middle of nowhere, and where are all the dinghies and the boats? And oh, by the way, the captain jumped ship, and see you later. What happened here is you had some passengers that use iPhone apps to work out their location of the ship, based where am I at? Where's the closest lifeboat? Others made ladders from sheets to reach the safety of the next deck, while other people were seen passively standing by or running aimlessly up and down the stairs. So you had kind of both worlds. You had people that were pretty calm, figuring out what do we need to do, where do we need to go, and you had people that were running aimlessly like, I don't know what's going on, that period of disbelief. So what made people react differently? People who are caught up in disasters fall into 3 categories. 10 to 15% remain calm and act quickly and efficiently. 15% completely freak out, no lie. They cry, they scream, they basically hinder the evacuation or the response. They're the ones that you want to just put in the corner and say, shh, go away. But they're the ones that most of the responders, where does all the effort go to? Those folks, right? The rest of the crowd are stunned, bewildered, and do very little. So what we found out is that people fall in one of these 3 categories. And it's interesting because reactions are not predictable based on a person's everyday personality. How many of you know people that are really, really calm? Some people are very black and white. How well do you think they do in a situation or an incident that may not be black and white? That's a little bit gray. That's a lot of chaos. Do you think they would function well? No. So what we do know is that personality doesn't dictate how we always will respond, our day-to-day personality. I have worked with a number of people in different type of response. I've been deployed all through the United States. And I have found that one of my favorite people that I worked with, an epidemiologist, really, really good with numbers and researching, and had the ability to give us all the information that we needed in a very short period of time in a quiet space. But once we put that person in a loud room, our EOC, they just froze and they stopped and they said, this is way too much information. This is way too much stuff going on. I can't handle it. And so we found out, you know what, this person functions better somewhere else in a quiet area. So their personality, the day-to-day, we thought they would handle it just fine because they do foodborne illness outbreaks and they're right on things. But day-to-day personality is a little different than how we respond during an incident. The way that we respond, there's a few reasons. One is there's a problem that we have a lack of data. When something happens and there's a situation you have to respond quickly, our brain cannot necessarily keep up with the amount of information that's coming to us to be able to process that. So our brain requires 8 to 10 seconds to handle each new piece of information. Do you think you have about 8 to 10 seconds before more information comes when you're handling an incident? It comes pretty quickly, right? Probably quicker than that. The more stress, the slower the process. So the more things ramp up, the longer it takes for our brains to process the information, to be able to figure out what's going on. And so as we're being bombarded with new information, our brains just shift into low gear to be able to say, wait, I'm on a little bit of information overload. So we don't have all the information needed in an emergency, and we need to be able to have that. That lends itself to the way that some people respond. The other thing is denial. Denial can also be more likely if people do not trust the source of the information. How many of you is that real information or not, based on who's saying it, right? So we all go through that. Back to that cruise ship, there was one passenger that did not initially believe that the ship was sinking because the warning, as they said, and it's a quote, had come from a dancer, and they do drama. So as this person standing there, this driver was like, the ship is sinking, the ship is sinking. They're like, oh, that's just the dancer, you know how that works. And so it took a little bit for them to process that information. Same thing happens, it depends on where we get information from on the level, how quickly we will process information, how quickly we'll believe that information, and how quickly we will act on that information. All right, so why do a few react calmly and quickly when most freeze? Why do you suppose that is in our world? Training. How many of you looked at the exits in this room to see how many doors there were to exit? It's good practice to go in all of the time, wherever you go into a room. Good practice. So many who make it out of disasters alive do something that most others don't. They go onto a plane or in a theater or in their workplace, and they study the exits. They imagine the scenario ahead of time, enabling themselves to work on automatic when the time comes to act, instead of wasting precious moments processing information. They exercise mentally. So every day is thinking about that. And I know, and of course, I've got friends of mine that say I'm paranoid, but it's true. Every place I go, I'm always aware of the situation of where the exits are, what could be the potential dangers. I think it's because I live and breathe this. So why do we exercise? So we know that some of the survivors, some of the people that do best are those that have gone through it before. Survivors survive not because they're braver or more heroic, but because they are better prepared. This shows that people can be trained to respond properly in disaster, and that's the best reason to exercise, and that's the best reason why we have our regulations that require us to exercise, because we know that does help. We know that the more that you can provide exercise and training, the better your staff will be prepared and confident, and you'll have a more efficient and effective response. So training can increase confidence, as I mentioned. They're better able to keep emotions in check during a disaster. If you are trained, you kind of go into that mode, and you know this is what I need to do and this is how I need to do it. It also reduces anxiety. The studies also show that the more that you are training and more familiar with what your roles and responsibilities are, that when you are faced with a situation that your anxiety level remains at the same as it was in your day-to-day, or just slightly increases as opposed to a high level of anxiety. So people are more likely to remember how to use equipment, how to undertake the drills, what are the things that are expected of them when they are trained to do that. Establish a base of support within leaders and stakeholders. Are there people within your organization that are champions, that are cheerleaders, that understand what you do, that could be there to support you? Grab onto those people and use them. That's going to be an important piece. Identify and recruit exercise planning team members. So not only you have the cheerleaders that are like, this is awesome, but are there people that also would be interested in being a part of the planning, that are maybe good planners that could give you some good insight? Grab them and have them and recruit them as part of the planning team members. And then, are there departments or people that are critical to an effective response to your facility? Are there people that should be there because either you know that they have a strong part in your facility, that they're critical, or that you know that they should be there because you've never tested that before? Think about who might have expertise to offer and who might want to join forces. Maybe there's another healthcare facility or another organization within your community that you could partner with and do some sort of exercising. Develop a project management timeline with milestones. And this sounds a lot harder than it is. All it means is if you are creating a plan, an exercise plan, think about what types of exercises might you want to do, what would be the timeline for getting that done, and you can base it on lots of things, and we'll talk about that. Homeland Security Exercise and Evaluation Program, which I mentioned earlier on, HSEEP. This is great. It's a great tool. They have after action reports and situation manuals and exercise plan, all the documentation you could need. This is not a requirement for healthcare facilities or CMS organizations to use HSEEP. It's just a nice tool. So we've got two tiers or two types of exercises when we're looking at the exercise design. We've got a discussion-based over here, and then we've got operations-based. Discussion-based are just as it says. You're sitting around the table, you're having a conversation, you're thinking about the what-ifs. Okay, you're having those conversations about maybe your plans or your policies, things that you may want to implement, procedures, agreements. It's typically a lower stress environment, and you sit around the table and you are given a scenario and with some questions. That's discussion-based. Operations-based, this is where you have a little bit more, there's more involvement, you're doing more and talking less. So this is where you're going to be validating those plans and policies, putting them into action. You know, these are where you have the drills, you clarifying roles and responsibility, identifying gaps. So discussion-based, these are the 4 types of discussion-based exercises. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can see that it goes from informal discussion, then a workshop, and then you have a tabletop exercise, which is probably more of what you guys have been involved with, and then a game is like a simulation that has rules and that kind of stuff. Operations-based, you've all done operations-based exercises because you've all done your evacuation drills and your lockdown drills and active shooter drills and all of tornado drills, all that stuff. Functional exercise, many of you have probably been involved with functional exercises, probably on a regional level, when the Southwest Healthcare Preparedness Coalition has done exercises in the past, and you may have been involved in that. And then full-scale exercise, this is where you have boots on the ground. This is where you're getting out the equipment, you're playing with all your stuff. You've got people that are moving around. You may have paper patients or real patients, moulaged or not, but that's the full-scale exercise. This is just the building block approach. As you can see, the more complex you go up through the full-scale exercise, the more planning and training that needs to occur, the more time it needs to take in order to make that happen. So some of the things that you need, a discussion versus operational-based exercise. Discussion-based is where you have, again, you're going to be looking at developing slides. You'll have probably a PowerPoint. You'll have what's called a situation manual, which will include the scenario and questions that you may want to have the participants ask. You'll have either a conference or breakout area where the people can sit and have that conversation. You may identify scribes and have evaluation, but typically the evaluation is through a participant feedback form. Hey, what were your 3 strengths? What were your 3 areas for improvement? What did you think of the exercise? And nice thing about this is it's relatively quick and cheap and easy to put together. As we get to an operational level exercise, this gets more complex. Typically, the documentation and the information, you have an exercise plan, which is like a situation manual, only it talks a little bit more about what's the role of a controller, what's the role of an evaluator, will there be media there, what's the safety message and the safety information. It also goes through the scenario and who will communicate with whom. There might be a communication plan. You have a master sequence of events list or scenario events list, otherwise known as a MESL. And this is really the roadmap that dictates how that exercise will be facilitated or controlled. It tells you what the messages are and what the expected actions are. You may have multiple sites during an operational based exercise, or may have multiple areas within your organization or facility that's participating. Whereas a tabletop, it may just be, you may have just one care area, one unit participating, but an operational based, you may have more than one. You may have several in your organization participating, or multiple agencies assisting you. You have evaluator and exercise guides, EEGs. This is just a way to verify whether or not you're meeting your objectives. Typically in an operations-based, you have a controller that helps to control the exercise to make sure the rhythm is going okay and the objectives are being met. And then you have evaluators that are evaluating the activities or actions based on what they're seeing in the exercise. Operations-based, you'll have probably more safety concerns because people are moving, you're shuffling things around, as opposed to a tabletop, you're basically sitting most of the time and not a lot of safety concerns. And then more of a lengthy process and more expensive because you're using more staff time, maybe some equipment, bringing in other folks. Planning becomes really important during an exercise. The purpose is determining the exercise objectives, tailoring the scenario to meet those objectives, and then logistical support. What types of things do you need for this particular exercise? You may want to think about who should be on your team this is a planning team, exercise director or a subject matter expert, somebody that's going to be driving the exercise and then controlling it. Planning coordinator, somebody that's going to be helping to plan the exercise. You may need a lead evaluator and a lead controller for operations-based. For discussion-based, you would need to have like a lead facilitator and a lead scribe, or somebody that's going to be taking notes for you. So this is a typical planning schedule for the type of exercise that you may want to pull together in your organization. These are just suggestions. It depends on how complex you want it to be and how many questions you have and what are your objectives, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Typically for a tabletop exercise, you still want to have an after-action report, but you base that after-action report on the participant feedback and the information that was shared with the scribes. And the functional and full scale, although it's not listed here under the after-action report, every exercise should have an after-action report and an improvement plan. Your auditors will want to see that. That'll be an important piece. Here's what we're looking at when we're designing an exercise. So the first thing you do is assess your needs. Then you define the scope. You write a statement of purpose, defining the objectives, composing the narrative, write a major and detailed events, list expected actions, and then prepare any messages or questions depending on what you want to do. So the first thing we do is assessing the need. This is going to help to define what our problem. Before we can do any exercise, we really want to say, well, what are we trying to exercise? What's the problem that we have here? We want to establish the reasons to do that exercise, and then we want to identify the functions that we should be exercising. So your hazards, your HVA, the risks that you are most likely to face and the priority levels of those hazards. What are you most at risk for, and how well are you prepared for that? Looking at that, looking at the areas that are most vulnerable. Are there areas within your facility? Are there areas within the community? Are you next to a rail transport? Are you next to an industrial plant? Are you next to a river? What does that look like in your environment, not just internally, but then externally as well? The functions most need of rehearsal, the potential participants who might be involved, that might dictate what your needs are. Do you have new people, new leadership, folks that are retiring that you want to get other people in and get their hands dirty a little bit? And then are there exercise requirements and capabilities as well? So you look at, again, you mentioned past exercises. Who participated in the exercise and who didn't? Do we want to get more people involved? To what extent were the exercise objectives achieved? So we do a lot of exercising in our organizations, but very little do we ever follow up on our improvement plan and say, okay, based on the last exercise, what is it that we learned, and maybe should we think about retesting something and re-drilling it? Sometimes it's just, we go from one exercise to the next, and sometimes it's based on the leadership driven, and sometimes it's based on grant deliverables, sometimes it's based on the regs that we're given. So it's really important to take a step back and think, okay, what did we do in the last exercise? How well did we do? What did we learn from that? Where were our weaknesses? And build on that. Because oftentimes what we see the same issues repeating itself from exercise to exercise to exercise. And then again, we talked about the lessons learned, what problems were revealed, and what is needed to resolve them. All right, the next thing is defining the scope. And what we want to do with this is the reason why we need to define the scope. All of a sudden you start creating an exercise, you think about an exercise, and you're like you had mentioned, we're going to do med-surg. And all of a sudden it's way out here. And what we want to do is to start to limit that and back it up and get it more focused. So the scope helps us to do that. And it's really, it keeps us in our swim lane, and it keeps us focused on what is the purpose of this exercise. So the scope puts realistic limits on the issues that you've identified in the needs assessment. So it helps to identify those areas of the highest priority that can be realistically tested. We know that you have a lot of areas that probably need to be tested, but I want you to prioritize what those areas are. And how could they be realistically tested and evaluated in an exercise? And then it determines who should be involved. So once you start looking at the scope, it helps give you that guiding path of who else needs to be involved. Do you need to involve EMS or fire, community partners, long-term care, or schools, or whatever you are looking at? So when we look at defining the scope, we look at functions or tasks that need to be practiced, tested, or evaluated, the agencies that need to be involved, the personnel necessary to carry out the exercise play, not just those who are participating, but when you're doing an operations-based exercise, there's a lot of moving parts. And so you need to make sure you have the people there that are designing the exercise, that are controlling the exercise, that are evaluating the exercise, and keeping things in pace. So it's tough for just one person to do that, but that's where it's important to get that planning team. The type of exercise that matches the exercise capabilities of the jurisdictions that you're working with that will produce the desired degree of realism. So we want to make sure that it is an actionable, realistic exercise that is being planned, and the scope helps us to do that. And then identifying the specific hazard. So you want to use a hazard that would be most likely to occur, or again, something that you know is a weakness in your plan or your exercises or real incidents that you've dealt with. And then the most logical location for the hazards to occur. So is this something that's going to occur outside of the facility? Again, are you near an area that would help you with the scenario itself? Are there things within your facility? Do you have a storage area of industrial chemicals or something that might cause some problems that you could utilize as part of the scenario? So that helps us, the scope helps us to define all of that. So this is a broad statement of the exercise goal. This is going to be the statement that you give to your leadership, to the media, to people that you want to have them have an understanding about what the exercise is about. It focuses and controls the whole exercise. So the purpose statement governs the selection of the objectives, which in turn governs the subsequent steps. So you write a statement of purpose, then we're going to be creating the objectives, and then the objectives help us to identify the tasks that we want to achieve, and then it kind of filters from there. It's used to help gain that admin support, leadership support, and assure participation by other departmental personnel. And again, it's helpful in communicating what you're planning to do to the media and community leaders. If you've not ever told the media or the community leaders or others that you're doing an exercise, I strongly suggest that you do that, only because it allows the community, it allows the leaders to let them know that you are working on preparedness, that you are continuing to be forward-thinking in your approach. Okay, so the purpose of the proposed tabletop, so this is an example. The purpose of the proposed tabletop exercise is to discuss the coordination of the activities within whatever agency or organization in the response to a major incident, to provide training to staff, to enhance interfacility coordination and cooperation by involving the following department or agency heads, and you list it. So defining the objectives, this is a description of the performance that you expect from participants to demonstrate competence. The objectives go hand in hand with the purpose statement, but they're more specific and performance-based. This is where we get into the task-oriented piece to say, what is it that you are expecting to see for the folks that are participating in the exercise? So why do we create objectives? It's part of the design process, it's part of the exercise conduct, the evaluation, and the follow-up. Every part of our exercise incorporates the exercise objectives. And again, I can't stress enough to say that the objectives are probably the most important part of your exercise design. If you take anything from this class, try to create really good objectives. The objectives are the pivot point in the design process. This is where the needs assessment, the scope, and the purpose statement all lead to the formulation of the objectives. The success of later actions and decisions begin with carefully written objectives. The narrative, the major detailed events, all of the things surrounding the scenario are tied to the objectives. The elements of the exercise should be conducted according to the objectives. You're trying to tease out those pieces of the objectives as you're during the exercise. The scenario would be a part of that. The inject messages that you provide, the communications that are going back and forth between the participants will all be tied to that objectives. And you also want to use the objectives to make sure that your exercise stays on track. Because a lot of times you'll start veering down a road. It's like, okay, but wait a minute, what were our objectives for this exercise? And it'll bring you back into that lane again. The evaluation, again, this is where your evaluators will probably be utilizing their exercise evaluation guide or some sort of an exercise form to help identify whether those objectives have been met. So they're going to utilize their objectives, your objectives that you created, to help them create the evaluation tool that will be used to evaluate the exercise, used to evaluate the things that the participants are doing. And then follow up, the participants retrain, plan, and practice to address the objectives that were identified. So how well did we do based on what we've identified as the objectives? We've learned from this, we have opportunities for improvement, and then you kind of circle back and say, okay, so if these objectives were not met, how can we mitigate that? If these objectives were met, that's great. Let's incorporate what we learned from that into our plan, and you can start that process over again. It's also okay to take objectives and use the same objectives that you're in different scenarios or different exercises that you're creating. If you aren't able, if you're just like, dang it, we just can't quite get that objective, continue to work on that objective until that objective is met. It's okay to do that. All right, so what makes a good objective? The main part is making sure that it's clear and concise so that everybody has an understanding about what the intent is, and that it's focused very, very well on the performance. What are you planning to have that person or that participant do? And we talk about performance. We're not talking about clinical. We don't, we're not asking about how well did they take a blood pressure. It's not that part of it. But it's how well did they perform based on any policies or plans that you have or procedures that you've identified. So in other words, an objective should state who should do what, under what conditions, according to what standards. Okay, so who should do what, under what conditions, according to what standards. So here is a sample objectives. Within 15 minutes, that's your standard, okay, of the alert and notification, that will be your conditions. The agency command team members, that's the who, will arrive at the designated agency command center. That's the what, or the specific action. So SMART objectives, the first S is standing for simple, simply phrased. It's brief and easy to understand. The worst thing is that you don't want to create an objective that nobody understands, because how are you going to have people try to reach that if they don't understand what the hell you want them to reach, right? And then the evaluators too. Well, I don't know what they were supposed to do because I can't understand what this objective is. So you want to be simple in the stating of it. You also want it to be measurable. You want to make sure that you can observe and that you are measuring it against something, okay? And everyone should agree on whether that objective is achieved. So an example is for like the decon. Did you don the PPE appropriately? Or what, so there's a level of measure that everybody can agree, yep, you need to put the gloves on last, or whatever you're talking about, Achievable. Making sure that it's not too difficult or impossible to achieve. What is so important during an exercise is we want people to be challenged, right? We want to test them, but we don't want them to feel overwhelmed and feel like a failure. Okay, we want to be able to build some of that confidence and have that, wow, we did really good in this area, and like, yep, we know we need to improve over here. So we want to make sure that the objectives that we are writing are also achievable, that they're not way up here that nobody could ever achieve that. Realistic, we want to make sure that it's realistic expectations for the particular exercise that you are developing, and we'll get into that in a minute. And then task-oriented. Sometimes the T's can stand for timed, depending on, if you want to have a certain, to test the objective that within a certain amount of time that you want this place to be evacuated or that you expect something to happen. So sometimes with the SMART objectives, there'll be two T's. One is you'll have a task-oriented that is focused on the behavior or the procedure that you want, and it's also timed that you want to know how long did it take for us to decon or fill that tank up before we had to empty it and how many people could go through. So that's the acronym for the SMART. We want you to look at the type of verbiage that you're using, the type of words that you're using to create the SMART objectives. Avoid vague verbs like know, understand, appreciate, be aware of, because you can't measure that, right? You can't really test it. You can't evaluate it. So we try, and I know this is really small, but we want you to use action verbs like assess, clarify, define, determine, demonstrate, establish, evaluate, examine, explain, identify, inspect, list, notify, operate, prepare, record, report, show, test, all of those things. You can use more, activate, implement. I mean, it's whatever, but we want you to use action verbs where you can say, yes, they were activated, they did activate it, they did notify. Things that you can evaluate. That's an important piece. All right, so the next part is a narrative. This is just setting the stage. This is telling the story. The purpose of this is to help you capture the attention. People want to have a story. It's important for people. It helps with buy-in. It helps to motivate people. It helps to be able to have them think through the process. So it has two important functions. It sets the mood for the exercise. Again, they need to feel motivated to participate. It captures their attention, and then it also sets the stage for any later action. So as you continue to build your scenario, you may want to add more information to give them more information about what's happening, to help them push towards that objective, to help them meet that objective. You may not give them all the scenario information right up front. You may give them a little bit, and then you give them a little bit more later as the situation unfolds. So it's really up to you. So the characteristics of a good scenario is the type of event. What type is it? What's the time of the occurrence, if you're going to do it in the morning, in the evening, in the fall, summer, winter, whatever. So what has happened leading up to the exercise? It's important to give some background information to say, here's what we know so far, and then information about what may happen and any weather conditions. If it's not a weather type of a scenario, you still want to provide weather conditions. It may impact your fire, drill. If it's raining, you need to be thinking about options for what if it's raining. You're going to continue on with your drill, or you're going to pop a tent, or what are you going to do? So think about those. That's all should be part of your narrative. For an emergency with warning time, like a tornado, the narrative often outlines the developing situation chronologically. So, a couple days you've got a little bit of storms brewing out west or whatever, and then you start seeing. So you can have that information build if it's able to be built. So unexpected event, chemical spill, terror bomb attack. The narrative may be shorter, or it may devote more detail to the environment of the emergency, like a nearby school, other chemicals that are stored, rush hours approaching. There may be a festival or a parade that may be getting in the way of some evacuation or some modification to be able to get EMS to you in a timely fashion. So that will help to create the intensity of that feeling. So here, this small wording here is just an example of a narrative for a tornado, but I'm not going to read it. But as you can see, it talks about giving a little background, the date, what happens, what's going on. There's been some tornado warnings, etc. The event that there has been an EF5 tornado that traveled throughout the region or throughout that community, what the result, what was damaged, what the resulting issue was. There's debris all over. Any subsequent actions, were there things within your organization or facility that you did? A tornado watch, what does that make your organization do? Or tornado warning, what would you do? And then the next day, if it's after the fact, you would provide more information. Next day meaning next day in the scenario, not necessarily next day during your exercise, but just giving you some background. So that's a sample. So the major and minor events, these are the things that are part of the exercise. The events are closely related to the objectives, as I mentioned. Most tabletops really don't need a whole lot. We don't use the master scenario events list into tabletop exercise. Typically they're used in the operations-based exercise. So you'll probably be utilizing something. It doesn't have to be long and complex, but you'll want to utilize that to help drive the exercise forward and make sure you're on track. Messages or injects are really important in an operations-based exercise. Again, as I mentioned, the injects or messages should be closely tied to the objectives. That's the whole purpose of why you're sending an inject or sending a message to a particular group of people or a particular exercise participant, is because you're trying to drive action to see if you're testing that objective. And so it allows for that to happen. The messages might relate to a large problem, like an announcement of a major event or something that happened, or a small problem depending on the purpose of the exercise. And again, they can be directed to a single person or an organization or whatever, depending on the needs of what you have and the purpose of that particular message or inject. We're not going to go through developing the messages or injects per se, but these are some sample messages or injects. So during an extended power outage, what do you feel is needed for the support of your emergency or essential function? That would be during a tabletop exercise, right? That would be a question that you would have. That's your general problem statement. But for an operations-based exercise, maybe there's a call from XYZ group home that they do not have enough transportation to evacuate all of their residents or all of their patients. Okay, so that would be considered an inject or a message, and you would put that on the master scenario events list. That this is an inject, who it's to, who it's from, what the message is, and then the next step we talk about is the expected action that you want that to happen. Or a call from XX hospital, they need to offload some green patients. How many can you handle within the next hour? So those are just examples of what we call inject or messages during an operations-based exercise. Let's talk a little bit about conducting the exercise. So you've done the planning for it, and you've created all your information, and we've gone through that process, and now you'll want to conduct the exercise. And in a discussion-based exercise, you have other documents that you need to create besides what you just went through. Typically you have a slide set, a PowerPoint or whatever to help go through the scenario in the module, but it's not necessary. You can just work off the situation manual. Facilitator guide, if it's a person that is new to facilitating, or if you have multiple tables and you want to have multiple facilitators at those tables, typically a facilitator guide is helpful to help them understand what their roles are. Participant feedback, getting the information back from the folks to say, okay, what went well, what were your challenges or opportunities for improvement, what did you like about the exercise, what could be improved on. That will help you both for the getting information back from them about what you need to enhance in the policies and procedures or things that you wanted to test, but also in your exercise design process. Discussion-based, typically 2 to 4 hours. If you can get people together for 2 hours, your leadership, you're doing awesome. Sometimes it's just an hour or half an hour. Operations-based, this is again where you're going to have the X plan, the exercise plan. It's like a situation manual, as I mentioned, but it goes a little bit more involved about the different roles and the timelines. This goes to the participants, so they don't get the secrets in the master sequence of events list or the MESL. They don't get that, but they do get information about what the scenario is, what the objectives are, how long the exercise will be, where it will be performed, all of that stuff. The exercise evaluation guide, again, we talked about this. This is a guide to help the evaluators to make sure that they're looking through the objectives and that you've met those or still need to have improvement on those. There's a controller and evaluator guide. Now this is getting to be more complex. So as you have an exercise that is a much larger scale, we have a controller and evaluator guide that helps provide information about their roles and responsibility and what they need to be thinking about. If you have multiple controllers during an exercise, you might have a lead controller that'll lead the entire exercise, but then you might have a controller that maybe is outside that's leading some of the activities that's going on outside, and you'll need to communicate via radio or something like that. So depending on how big your exercise gets, you may need to have some of these documents. You don't need to have them if it's a smaller exercise, or you can really modify these to be real simplified. The master sequence of events list or master scenario events list, or MESL as we call it, that's an important thing. Again, this will go to your controllers, this will go to your evaluators, but it will not go to the participants. The inject messages, that's an important part. In exercise that I've done, I have either radioed injects. I have had patients be acting as the inject because the inject is the surge. I've emailed injects out or the messages. We've done WebEx. So there's a lot of different varieties of ways of getting those injects or those messages out to your people. So it just depends on what works for you. Typically can last 4 to 8 hours, but can also course over a few days. I've done infectious disease outbreak scenarios where we're starting to see some things bubbling up. And so we'll have a couple of activities or actions occurring in the healthcare facility as they start thinking about what this might look like. And then on the day of the actual exercise, if something might hit their facility or they need to deal with something. So it depends on what your objectives are, what you want to test. Okay, so now the exercise is done. Everybody's like, yay, that worked out well, and we learned some things. Now we need to evaluate. So with the discussion-based, you're looking at evaluating your plans, policies, and procedures, your resources and capabilities, and any interagency or interjurisdictional relationships that might occur. For your operations-based, you're going to be evaluating maybe the effectiveness of communications, were the tasks performed correctly, ability to use proper equipment, doing it in a timely manner. All of your, as I mentioned, all of your evaluation will be tied to your objectives. And then you have the hot wash. So hot wash is just a debriefing of the folks that were there. It includes the participants that participated in the exercise. It also includes the evaluators and the controllers. Everybody just kind of gets together and say, hey, how did things go? What went well for you? And it's just an ability and a time for people to talk about the exercise. We find that this is a really important thing because really, even though it's an exercise, people are training like they should respond, right? And so sometimes the stress and anxiety level for folks kind of goes a little bit high during exercise. So this gives them that time to debrief and kind of talk about how things went, and they just have to just get it off their chest. And so this is an important thing to have occur. So you try to do it as close to the end of the exercise as possible. You know, don't wait 2 weeks. If you can do it right away afterwards, this is the best way. Wanting to get the immediate impressions, you know, what went well, what needs to be improved. And typically it's led by a facilitator. It can be the exercise designer, the director, it can be a controller or an evaluator, but somebody needs to lead that conversation so you don't have kind of chaos and people just randomly talking. Because what you're trying to do is also to take notes for here too. This is a good way to capture information that's hot off the press, where people are oftentimes censored and they're like, hey, you know, that really was horrible, or man, that really worked well, I'm so proud of what we did. And it just gives you that quick response for how things went. Typically then after a while, you may want to do a participant feedback. Give people some time to digest things. You don't have to do this. If you've done a hot wash, you don't have to do a participant feedback. Oftentimes the participant survey or feedback form is typically used during a tabletop exercise. Back in the day we did the paper-based, but now a lot of times it's web-based. You can do SurveyMonkey or something like that. And again, it's you know, how did things go for you? What were the lessons that you learned? It was nice having the paper-based because then you could just say, you can't leave until you hand this to us, because sometimes people just say, I don't want to fill out that survey, and then they forget. And this is such an important piece because you need to have the feedback from the participants. This helps to determine if the participants felt the objectives were met. So it's a two-way street. It's not just identifying whether or not the design team felt it was a good exercise and that the objectives were met, or that the evaluator said it was a good exercise and the objectives were met, but did the participants feel this way as well? And then it's important to include some open-ended questions to identify any concerns or training gaps. So what would you recommend we have training in the future on? You know, allow them to give you some objective thoughts about that, as opposed to how would you rate this 1, 2, 3. So allow some of those open-ended questions. Then you have an after-action report, and this will be important for for your regulators, for your audits, CMS, JCO, for the emergency management grants, for the HPP or public health grants. All of those require after-action reports. MDH, if it is a grant-delivered exercise by the coalition, that Department of Health does have a particular after-action report that is supposed to be used, but I know that coalitions have simplified that, and so you'll want to talk to John or Ann about that, the requirements for your after-action report for if it's relating to a coalition exercise. But it should be prepared after exercise, summarize what happened during the exercise, provide feedback to participants, and recommend improvements. Probably the most important part of an after-action report is the improvement plan, because that's going to identify where you need to improve. We all are excited about our strengths, and we should, relish in that and celebrate that, but we need to be able to take what we've learned from that and utilize that in future exercises so that we can better prepare to respond effectively and efficiently. So this is just a recommended format for the after-action report, and I'm not going to go through it. One of the things to make sure of, if you are exercising in a regional exercise in this coalition or in your community, make sure that you either get a copy of that after-action report or make sure that your name or organization is associated to that with that after-action report. Because if your name isn't on it, your organization isn't on it, you didn't participate according to the state and the feds. So just something to keep in mind, double check, make sure that you've identified, that you've been identified on that document. All right, as I mentioned, the improvement plan, this converts the recommendations from the AAR into measurable steps. What is it, if we found something that needs to be improved upon, what are the measurable steps that we can take in order to make sure that we're mitigating that gap or mitigating that improvement? And it also provides who will be responsible for helping to mitigate that or close that gap and the date by which you think that that will be completed. And then it can inform future activity. So again, I can't strongly encourage enough that your improvement plan for any exercise or real event or incident that you're involved in, that you take a look at this prior to doing any other exercises and get some information from here about what you can continue to improve upon. Because I've seen so many organizations and coalitions that they continue to repeat the same problem over and over again because they haven't taken the step to say, let's work on our improvement plan. Let's try to mitigate this gap, and it just kind of repeats itself. So something to keep in mind, that the improvement plan is probably the most important part of that after-action process.